I think we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going here to introduce Kayla Cross, who is here with us today to give us a presentation. She's from the Mid-Atlantic. She's the Mid-Atlantic Regional Supervisor of Invasive Plant Control. Kayla studied at the University of Rhode Island and graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science and Management. In 2016, she was hired by Invasive Plant Control for a seasonal intern position for the Mid-Atlantic region, and since then has worked her way up to regional supervisor. Kayla has worked with a variety of clients on invasive species management plans, including the National Park Service, Fairfax County Park and Stormwater, the National Arboretum, and Arlington County Parks, to name a few. IPC specializes in select invasive species management and has worked across the US as well as internationally. And we are here to welcome Kayla.
Hey folks. Hope everyone's doing good tonight. I'm gonna go ahead and get my screen shared to you and we can get going. I'm gonna be, here I'll bring up and then we'll talk about, second. Okay, one moment, it's just going to the slideshow. My computer is a little slow. One second. Oh, come on. Apologies. Let's go back up here. Okay. All right. Hi, folks. As Heidi mentioned, I am the Mid-Atlantic Supervisor for Invasive Plant Control. I primarily work in the Northern Virginia region. We do a little bit of work in Maryland, and we occasionally, this region will occasionally branch out and travel to Pennsylvania, New Jersey, North Carolina, but primarily our crews are just about here. So today I'm going to be giving you folks an overview on two invasive vines, Porcelain Berry and Milemint. Okay, so we're going to start with Porcelain Berry. To go over just some of these key characteristics, it is a deciduous perennial woody vine, means it loses its leaves every year, and then you have those ugly vines hanging all winter long. It can climb up to 20 feet in trees, as you can see that picture up to the right. So that's a bunch of porcelain berry vines that are pretty much all the way to the tippity top of those native mature trees. You can see it kind of looks sad. That's because we cut all those vines, so those vines are dying out. The leaves are heart-shaped lobes and a little bit toothed. The bark is a rough brown bark with a white pith, which we're going to be going more into. It has white flowers in the late summer to early fall, and then followed by the flowers come these very colorful berries that you typically see all over the place, and birds are all over, and they can spread by seed and by resprouting from roots. It grows in partial to full sun, and you primarily find porcelain berry along, waterways, forest edges, areas of disturbance. For instance, the picture shown above was in kind of an open field in a park in Fairfax, and the entire perimeter was basically just all porcelain berry, and the whole middle was porcelain berry. All righty, so we're gonna move along. Okay, so what's the problem with porcelain berry? As most invasive species, one of the biggest problems that they present is that they have very quick growth compared to native species. You can see that it's at the bottom right picture, that porcelain berry on the ground is just about covering everything like a thick blanket. So you can see how that's difficult to compete with. And then going on to how it spreads by the seeds and its root sprouts, obviously being able to spread by two different means gives it a leg up, kind of a double threat almost. The seeds are those really bright, beautiful berries that are just really attractive to your wildlife birds. And so they frequently get eaten by these animals. And then, as you can imagine, they get distributed all around in the animal's waste. And so it just spreads more and more. And then the next is how it, as I was mentioning with the ground, how it just smothers the vegetation, but also take a look at the top left picture. You can really get a sense of how that porcelain berry is just completely covering those trees, where it almost looks like an impenetrable wall that you're going to walk into when you get up to that wood edge. So that's not letting in any light into the woods. It's not letting any native regeneration happen. So it's not only causing stress to those native trees, which eventually those trees are going to die out due to that stress, but it's also not letting any new saplings come up, any native saplings or seedlings come up. So it ends up really just becoming pretty much a porcelain berry or invasive species wasteland, essentially. And then, as you can imagine, with a lot of invasive vines, especially these woody invasive vines, there's a big concern of safety, especially with trails running through parks, near HOAs and where people live. A lot of these kind of invasive vine curtains are used to conceal either illegal or illicit behavior. It has been a concern that people have called IPC for specifically, not just ecological purposes, but also for those purposes. Okay, so going into native lookalikes. The biggest thing that porcelain berry gets confused with is its varieties of grapes. There's different wild grapes in this region. There's a few different varieties. I'm not exactly sure the exact number, but it doesn't matter. All ID tips go for any type of grape versus porcelain berry. So the best ways of IDing grape from porcelain berry is by the pith, fruit, and the bark. So starting with the pith, there's going to be other pictures on another slide, by the way, folks, to discuss the fruit and the bark. Sorry, my baby is being a little bit cranky in the back. So the pith for porcelain berry. Now, to be able to check the pith, you also need to make sure that the vine is a little bit mature. Those really young vines are difficult to cut in half and check to see if there's a pith. Sometimes you get lucky, but you normally need to find a little bit more mature of a vine to cut. And then that very center of the vine will have that white dot. And only porcelain berry will have that. No grape will have that. Grape, as you can see in the picture below, will have a brown pith. And that's always a telltale sign. Going on to the fruit, porcelain berry has those brightly colored berries that I was discussing. And what's important to also remember about the berry is not only the color, is that they will grow upward from the vine, unlike your traditional grape that will grow downward from the vine that you would picture in your head when you're thinking about a grapevine. So that's always a good sign. If you see those berries sitting up nice and tall and you think, oh, is that great? You can know that is porcelain berry. Very quick, easy ID method. Grape species, they have either green, black, or purple berries, and like I said, going in that downward position. The bark also, it's a little bit easier once you have a more mature bark. You'll be able to tell the difference with the immature vines with the bark at some point, but even then, every now and again, it can still be a little bit difficult. So you've got to look around for a few more mature vines to compare that bark. The porcelain berry bark, like I said, is that rough brown bark, but it won't be able to peel into strips. It'll almost look like you can peel it into strips, but it'll more or less just kind of crackle in your hand and just kind of crack apart. Grape, you'll literally be able to peel a full strip off. And so the next slide, we'll go into those pictures. I added this picture to the right just to kind of show you how crazy porcelain berry can get mixed in with other invasives, and you can kind of see the hodgepodge of blue, which is the herbicide. So like we're selectively spraying for the porcelain berry over, the other vegetation on site. So I just thought that'd be a fun thing for everyone to take a look at. Okay, so the pictures all on the top row are all examples of grape, and then all the pictures on the bottom row are examples of porcelain berry. The grape, as you can see that top left picture, you can peel it. There's a great image of that bark coming right off the stem. And then below that, you can see that porcelain berry bark that it looks crackly, but you would never be able to actually peel that bark. And then the next one over is going to be the difference in the fruit, the growing downward versus the growing upward, the different and variation in colors, how porcelain berries actually look like little porcelain berries. The grape leaves, you know, so the leaf can be very tricky sometimes. With different grape varieties, you're like, oh, that's definitely grape. But every now and again, you do get some grapevines that can be more lobes looking like these porcelain berry leaves on the bottom. So it's just something to note. The leaf is not always a telltale sign. Some porcelain berry can be more palmate too, and more almost grape-like. So they both can almost look like each other in different circumstances. What I have noticed in a little bit of a helpful tip, I think, is that porcelain berry almost seems to have more purple on the stem. If you're looking at this bottom right picture, you can almost tell versus the bottom left, top right picture, which has more brown in the stems. I've kind of noticed that porcelain berry tends to be more purple, grape tends to be more brown. Okay, so moving on to how to treat and control. So with the younger vines, you can hand pull them, but you have to really make sure you're being careful to hand pull every little bit of that root out. Otherwise, that infestation is just going to continue. If there are any berries on the vines, then you're going to make sure that they should be bagged and disposed of. That's usually why you'll see some resources say it's best to treat in the fall, but I still say it's best to get in there before August and September, before it starts to seed, so you're not messing around with any of that fruit falling around, spreading it around, possibly creating more disturbance. It's very easy to get in there a little bit before. I mean, granted, it's a billion degrees here in July, but it's a good idea to get that porcelain berry cut before it goes any farther. When you are cutting those vines, you're going to want to make sure that you chase those mature vines down into where it meets the soil, and that's where you're going to want to cut it. If you're going to cut the vine halfway up, it's not going to do anything good. If you try to treat it, it's not going to do anything good. It's just going to let that vine continue to grow and just more vigorously, if anything. So make sure when you're cutting those mature vines, you're cutting it where it meets the ground. It can be treated with triclopyr or glyphosate. Either are effective. The option of basal barking with the oil-based triclopyr is always an option as well for some of those thicker vines. Ground cover foliage can be backpacks treated with triclopyr. I usually suggest triclopyr because glyphosate is a non-selective herbicide. So if you have any grasses, anything that you can try to save in that area, it's a good idea to use a broadleaf specific herbicide so you can keep some of your sedges and grasses alive. Once established, management will be needed for 3 to 5 years. Porcelain berry is known to have an aggressive seed bank. It puts out a lot. It's a prolific seeder. It spreads aggressively. So you're going to need to make sure that you're really realizing the time commitment you're going to be putting into. Obviously, it's best to get anything before it gets too crazy. You notice porcelain berries starting to show up in your yard, control it before it gets too large. Things are going to get really ugly when you start treating because it's going to look just like a lot of dead vines, a lot of dead foliage. But I added this picture to the right just as a reminder that when we start to get rid of invasives, a lot of times your native seed bank will be able to resurge. This was a really cool find that we found of a rare yellow native passion flower that was actually underneath complete curtains of wisteria. So yes, it's going to look ugly for a year or two, but I like to remind you, your native seed bank is under there. Just give it a chance to come out, and you never know what's going to be there. So don't panic that you're just killing everything in sight. Just remember, if you start to get rid of the invasives, there's a chance, and then also saving your native trees. All right, I think that's all for porcelain berry. I'm going to move on to myelominate, and then we will take questions on both of those vine species. Okay, myelominate. I'm going to take one quick sip of water. Thank you. Okay, so Mile a Minute is a little bit different of a vine that we're dealing with. As you notice, I didn't really talk too much about non-chemical options for porcelain berry because there isn't really that many options out there because of its woody structure, its deep root system, and its prolific seeder. So talking about Mile a Minute, it's going to be a little bit of a different story because it's a herbaceous annual. So it's not a woody perennial, it's a herbaceous annual, which makes a big difference. So we still worry about it in regards to trees because well, I'll get to why it's a problem in a second, but it has a shallow root system, very distinct triangular leaves. The vines are covered in little barks, so if you're hand pulling, you're going to want to make sure you have some gloves on. If you don't, they don't hurt that bad, but it can be pretty uncomfortable. It has colorful berries, and will begin seeding late July to early August. And then once it starts to seed, it will continuously seed until it goes dormant. So it is quite literally the definition of a prolific seeder. It just, well, I forgot the exact number, but it puts out an astronomical amount of seeds per season. So what's the problem? Well, that's one of them, is that it's a prolific seeder. It can form these really dense mats, and that's why we worry about it when in regards to talking about our native trees, because any little saplings on the ground, any native vegetation that's trying to come up, and you've got a Mile a Minute infestation, it will completely cover it, and it will smother it, and it will completely shade it out for the rest of the season. And it's a very quick growing, like I said, with all the other invasives. A major problem is it's excessively quick growth. You'll see Mile a Minute, it's kind of crazy. You'll see it go from these little tiny seedlings in early season, and then next thing you know, you come back a month later and it is Mile a Minute everywhere, just everywhere. And then in that winter, you can actually still see the remnants even when it dies out for the winter. You'll see these red, dead vines everywhere, kind of just littered. So it may not be a heavy hitter woody wise, but it can still be very problematic for your native populations. Okay, so it is pretty unique looking, but still out there, there are a couple lookalikes when you're moving quickly, and you might not be super used to going after Mile a Minute. A few lookalikes would be things like morning glory, hog peanut, and field bindweed. Anything with that kind of triangular shape and it's a smaller leaf, it can trip you up when you are, you know, you're in go mode. You're just like, okay, let's get all these vines, all this invasive. You think you're looking at all invasives, and then you might be starting to pull some hog peanut, which is beneficial, or some morning glory. I think field bindweed and hog peanut are probably the most common to be confused with it. But luckily with Mile a Minute, there's a lot of easy things you can go back and check. Are there little tiny barbs on the vines? Does it have that, I can't remember what that's called at the moment, I'm sorry. Does it have that little, what is that called? The extra little leaf that goes around the leaf, basically, around the berries, basically. That's kind of very unique to Mile a Minute. Does it have the berries growing out in that way? So you can kind of take a look at a couple of different characteristics to try to key out what you're looking at compared to hog peanut, morning glory, or bindweed. Okay, so how to treat and control. It's very easy to hand pull, luckily, like I said, because it's very shallow root system, very fibrous vines. Wear gloves, a little bit prickly, not terrible. I bring up the flame weeder and heat weed because those are new non-chemical methods that we also have been messing around with. Those non-chemical options are becoming more and more accessible to people for, you know, these more herbaceous species that can be easily treated with those instead of possibly chemical. You know, you need those shallow root systems. Otherwise, that flame weeder is just gonna burn up the top part and it'll regrow. And same with the heat weed, it needs to be a shallow root system to be able to take that in and start to die. This can also be foliar treated with rhodiola or triclopyr. I still suggest triclopyr. So if you have any grasses or sedges underneath that they can actually live and you're not just bare grounding your area. As you know, more disturbance, less and more invasive. And then pre-emergent, my boss, Mr. Lee Patrick, suggested the preen. I heard that is a homeowner approved pre-emergent. Pre-emergent's great to be used with the mile a minute just because of that aggressive seed bank. Obviously, it's not going to let up any of your native seed banks, but if you have some nice perennials planted and you want to keep that at bay, that's a really good option. I think that is my citations. And then I had a question. Paige, any questions? I'd be happy to answer. I think we have a couple minutes.
So one of the questions was to have you elaborate a little bit on some of the herbicide treatments that you were doing, especially they said the with bark, which I know is not, there's another technical term to go with that.
For the what?
The statement they said was with bark treatment.
Oh, the basal bark treatment.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, so you can, like I was saying, you can use for the broadly, the backpack foliar spray with just like your basic water soluble triclopyr or glyphosate. You can cut and treat with concentration of glyphosate or triclopyr as well. But the basal bark is your oil carrier, where it's your oil. It's basically, it's almost like vegetable oil that you're using instead of water. And then you mix that with about 25% Garlon 4 Ultra, and that is the oil soluble version of triclopyr. And then maybe mix it down to more like 20%. Actually, 25 would be a little high for that. And then you would paint the lower 18 to 20 inches of that stump. So if you had a nice big porcelain berry vine growing up, a tree, and you could get that lower, 20 inches, all you'd have to do is just make sure that entire vine is painted all the way around for that lower end, and it gets absorbed into the roots, and then we'll kill the entire vine in place without any cutting.
So a couple of other questions that came up was whether there was a mile a minute flower before the berries at all.
I believe so. I don't know why. I'm just blanking on that. I cannot think of what that looks like. Second. Yes. So we'll get a flower. I think they tend to be either white or purple. It's just, I don't think they're that noticeable. You tend to notice it ends up, notice the fruit before you end up realizing the flowers are there.
Okay. And what about thorns on hog peanut?
No thorns on the hog peanut. The hog peanut actually looks a little bit more like kudzu, like a smaller kudzu. So it's a very smooth vine. It stays very small, doesn't get very big, but
okay,
no vines, no thorns.
Somebody asked about the toxicity of the herbicides.
Great question. So all the herbicides are water safe and soil safe. And so they are safe to be used in a lot of these sensitive areas. They are not soil active. So once that herbicide hits the soil, it becomes bound up in the soil. So it's not active any longer. It can't affect the tree next to it. It can't affect the plant next to it. So as long as you don't get that herbicide right on the green leaves, I'm sorry, give me 1 second.
Somebody actually asked if there's a
You
safe
have to put on it.
them off trees other than pulling them. Margaret, you want to answer that? Since I think we can answer. Kayla's back. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so and so everything that we use is soil safe. The pre-emergent is obviously soil active, so that's one that you want to be a little bit more careful of. You really want to make sure you're reading your labels. and make sure you're using it properly and according to the law. Don't ever forget, whatever you're using, the label is the law. So any ready-to-use products, any products approved by the homeowner, approved to be used by the homeowner, anything like that.
Okay.
What about the surfactants? Isn't that a problem? And because that's what most people will be buying, is a ready to use.
Yeah, so the ready to use, normally the problem is that the surfactants are the issue. And so we use water safe surfactants that we add to our own mixes. So the ready to use, you really want to make sure you're reading it, because a lot of those aren't water safe. They shouldn't be near where there's a shallow water table. Those shouldn't be sprayed where you have, you know, a semi-dry stream or anything like that. Any case that it could come in contact with flowing water, you need to be careful of that. So what we do is that we personally use concentrate, and then we mix it to the concentration that we need, the lowest that is for the best effective use. And then we use our own surfactants, which are usually all aquatic labeled because of the areas we work.
If you have time to type in the chat the names of the products you referred to, that would be very welcome by everyone. And do I understand correctly that with cut stump treatment, you don't need the surfactant anyway? If you
Correct.
buy the straight herbicide. But have you found any way to buy it in less than a gallon size?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Yeah, that's really.
I think most of the time you have to buy it in usually like a 2.5 gallon container. Here, glyphosate cream. And then Garlon for Ultra is the, I could be spelling Triclear wrong, folks. I'm really sorry.
So somebody also asked if there's a safe way to remove the vines off trees other than pulling them, such as with a rake.
So the best thing to do, honestly, is just cut them at eye level and then go and chase those vines down to where they meet the soil. And then you create that window, but then leave those vines in the trees to die, and then they'll decay and fall on their own. That way you're not pulling on branches. Sometimes you have other vines in there like greenbrier, which makes it a lot more difficult and a lot more springy. Or if it's tied up with a native vine like a Virginia creeper, anything like that, it's usually best to just let it be and let it decompose where it's at. That's usually the best rule of thumb for anything. If you're, you know, able to foliar spray something, let it lay, let it stay there, let your vegetation decompose on site.
All right. Well, great. Any other questions that anybody has? Okay.
Great, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Well, Kayla, thank you very much. This was great. Really
You're so
appreciate
welcome.
having you here today.